Welcome back to Inside the Paddock. We have a busy episode today talking about the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, a sprint weekend, lots of action, and we got a back-to-back this week in Miami. Lots to talk about. You're listening to Inside the Paddock. Here we go. Welcome back to Inside the Paddock. We got lots to talk about this weekend. Kenji, you want to kick us off with some review of what went down in Baku?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with a brief review of the race last weekend. All right, so we had Perez in first. Verstappen, on the other hand, had a bit of an off weekend, we could say, and he only took P2. And Leclerc with Ferrari taking the last spot on the next up, we had Alonso in fourth and Sainz in fifth. And finally, to round up the top six, we had Hamilton taking out the last spot. And this was the first sprint weekend for 2023. And you had Leclerc on pole for a change, and Perez, I think, in third, if I'm not mistaken, and Verstappen in second. And Perez taking the first sprint race victory of 2023. And that kind of gave us a clue of how his pace would be on Sunday, as Perez obviously taking the win over Verstappen and Leclerc. It was a bit of a boring race, shall we say, for Baku. Not a whole lot of action. There was a bit of intrigue over the front runners, was there, but not really as much action have gone used to having with Baku. So yeah, what do you guys think?
Yeah, it was definitely first. I think we got it wrong, kind of what our idea of what the sprint weekend was. So I just want to, I guess, apologize for that. We kind of thought there wasn't going to be an actual race anymore, which there was. So just get that out of the way. I guess we could go on to some winners and losers. If we want to pull up the results. I think it was a really good weekend for Leclerc. Obviously, the Ferrari still doesn't have the pace to keep up with Red Bull, but staying ahead of Verstappen in the sprint and then staying on the podium in the race and then getting pole twice was impressive by him. So I think he's my winner of the weekend, I guess.
Yeah, I think Ferrari really maximized the result this weekend. Last weekend, I mentioned how I didn't really expect Ferrari's pace, during qualifying and during practice to carry over to the race, just considering how dominant Red Bull has been in race trim and especially on the straights. So really the best I think they could have gone was P3, and to see Leclerc take P3 really was just a maximization of their result. I was a bit disappointed with Sainz though, and just starting the year off, he hasn't really been the type of driver we've gotten to know from like his McLaren years and stuff like that. So, do you guys think he's gonna figure that out and improve as the season goes on?
I think he's already shown in past years that he's a very competent driver. I think last year he finished close to Leclerc in the championship, or did he finish ahead of him?
No, he didn't.
No? Okay. But I have faith in Sainz. I think looking back to his McLaren days, he was battling with Norris for kind of the best driver at McLaren, and we see that Norris is a very good driver, and he's able to push that McLaren into the points as he did in Azerbaijan, where he was able to get ninth, and in qualifying he was able to even push that car into seventh. So I wouldn't lose hope in Sainz just yet. I think it's early enough on in the season where we can just have hope that he can bounce back and that maybe he's had a couple of off races. But looking at my winners and losers, I think Perez winning is big because it kind of closes the gap to Max in the drivers' standings, we have Max with 93 and Perez with 87. So it's really coming down to kind of race by race. But that's also going back to earlier on in what I said, which is that we are only 4 races into the season. And so we shouldn't be expecting too much from these drivers. But my big loser, we talk about this a lot, is De Vries. He's kind of been the big loser in every race. I think earlier on in the race, I think he took a shunt into the wall, which was completely driver error, just showing that he has had a terrible transition from Formula E to Formula One. So he's been the big loser of the season, but he kind of just showed us this race that he is consistently bad.
Yeah, I think you brought up some good points, Tim, especially considering the fact that we were just coming off, I guess, I don't know if you can call it the summer break, but we're getting close to June, but like a 4-week break between Australia and Azerbaijan. So maybe that has something to do with both, Sainz and De Vries and their struggles. Speaking of Norris, I know you kind of touched on him with your comparisons to Sainz's McLaren days, but I would say that McLaren were one of the winners. I don't know if they're like one of the big winners, but I would say they're one of the smaller winners of this weekend. They were able to replicate to a degree their success from Australia. And of course, Australia is a really incident-ridden race, so I'm not sure if those really representative of what they can do. But with Norris in 9th and Piastri in 11th, just outside the points, I would say that McLaren were one of the big winners. One of the winners of this weekend. And yes, with De Vries crashing out and causing the safety car, he hasn't had quite the start that I've wanted him to have, and I've kind of touched upon that in previous episodes. But like you said, Tim, it's only race 4, and I think it's a bit premature to be talking about like a seat and everything like that being at risk potentially.
Yeah. My loser of the weekend for another weekend is Alpine. They disappointed again, which I'm not too upset about. But I mean, I remember we were talking about them maybe like having a chance to, maybe not for the whole season challenge with like a Ferrari or one of the top 4 teams, but at least being easily locked into that 5th place. And now it looks like with the upgrades McLaren has, with AlphaTauri looking good, Williams, like they might not even get 6th. Like they might be bottom few teams, and they've got pretty good drivers. Their car was supposed to be pretty good, but they're just not extracting the performance right now, and it's hurting them.
It really is. It really sucks because ever since Australia, I know it's only been one race, but it seems like the crash that they had on like the last few laps really gave them bad momentum and put them on the wrong foot. But I do think that they're bringing some upgrades this weekend, so we'll see how that affects their performance. But with that being said, Ferrari, I think, are also bringing upgrades, and I think it's like their first package of the whole year, if I'm not mistaken. So Alpine really need to figure it out if they're looking to challenge the way we expected them to at the beginning of the year.
Yeah. I think we can move on to some predictions. I think Tim had an idea of something we could do over the course of the season for our predictions.
Yeah, so last week we made predictions on who we thought the podium would be. We had Kenji saying that it would be Verstappen in P1 and then Perez and Hamilton in P2 and 3. We had me with Verstappen, Leclerc, and Perez. And then we had Charlie with Perez, Verstappen, and Leclerc. And so me and Kenji got nothing right other than the fact that some of those drivers were on the podium, but Charlie got all 3 of those right. So I think something that we could do is kind of use points. So if you get the number 1 driver correct, you get 3 points. P2 is 2, and then P3 is 1. So if we use that, then me and Kenji are at no points and Charlie's at 6 right now. And then we could just keep this going for the rest of the season and see how we stack up against each other near the end.
Yes, I will gloat about my psychic abilities. Perez, he did get ahead kind of off a safety car thing, but he was really good all weekend, and Verstappen had ample time to pass him if he was going to do so in that race, and he didn't. So I think Perez definitely had the better race, and then Leclerc held off for P3. So I am winning by a lot in our current battle. So y'all are gonna have to get your game up.
Yeah, fair play to you, Charlie. Yeah, Verstappen really didn't seem to live up to what I expected him to do this weekend, and that might be related to what Perez was able to do on the street circuits, which I remember was one of your reasons for picking him to take the victory last weekend. So yeah, fair play to you, Charlie.
Yeah. What were y'all's thoughts on the sprint format? Because it was the first time that we've seen this format. And I know that last week we had our doubts about it. And this week, I think we saw some like different strategies used. I think there was a point where Norris and McLaren tried to like make a loophole so that he could go out even though he had used all of his soft tires on an intermediate pair. I don't know if y'all saw that. But what are y'all's thoughts on that? Or how do y'all like the new sprint format?
I honestly didn't really like it at all. I know I already kind of like touched on it, and I was one of the big opponents to it, if you can call it that, last weekend. But I didn't feel like it added much to the weekend, and it was a bit like clumsy almost in its execution because yes, they're trying something new, and like I said, I appreciate that F1 is doing that, but it seems like they've gotten all the wrong ideas. If this is what they're trying to do, because the sprint was really just another race. It was just a smaller race, and it had no impact on Sunday, which is the main event. So I feel like it didn't really add anything to the weekend, and I really did prefer the other sprint format where we had the smaller sprint, which decided the grid on Sunday, over what we have now.
Yeah, I mean in general, I don't think the sprint is necessary. I'd rather just have every weekend be the same. It just seems more like fair and uniform when you're competing for a championship of this level. But if you're gonna do it, I do actually like this format more than the previous one because of the qualifying added to it. I didn't really like how. I mean, obviously, if you like crashed in the sprint race, then you could get sent to the back. But just in general, qualifying tends to mix up the grid more than the race does. Like Leclerc being on pole, and when you don't, when you allow like cars 20 laps or so to sort themselves out in the order that they really are, it just kind of makes the race less interesting usually. So I do like the fact that there's qualifying for the race and there's qualifying for the sprint, and they don't link up with each other.
Yeah, I just don't, like I said, I don't think it really adds anything to the weekend. I get that. I understand Charlie's reason that it previously, like the sprint would cause previously like unordinary like grid orders to become more ordinary because the drivers would have 20 laps to sort themselves out, and I think that's fair. But at this point, I just don't really like the sprint, and I know maybe sometimes it'll grow on me, but I feel like they're just changing something that wasn't really broken in the first place. And I prefer not to have any sprints at all, which is kind of what Charlie said. So yeah.
Yeah, me too. I feel like they're just trying to do too much. Like it was so confusing that we got it wrong last episode even. Like, it just doesn't really make sense to essentially have 2 qualifyings and like 2 races. Like, it's just, I feel like it's making the sport more confusing rather than more exciting.
And I think like the part of the reason why they're in all of these new things is to attract like new fans. Just causing like more of a drama because who wants to watch 2 practice sessions, right? Um, Practice isn't really something that the fans are interested in. So I would speculate that the reason why they're trying these new things is to attract new fans. But as you mentioned last weekend, and as you mentioned, Tim, as well, it just seems to make things more confusing, which is counterintuitive towards that goal. It seems like it's just pushing fans away. So I'm not sure what exactly the idea is here. And I really hope they drop the sprint format because it's just messing up the sport, really.
Yeah. All right. And last thing about Baku, obviously Perez won sprint, won the Grand Prix. Do we think that he has a chance in this? Like, he looked on the ball and he seems to believe in himself, which is good. But I don't know. It seems like it's him and the street circuit to get along, but Max is really good when it's on every other normal park circuit.
I don't think, I think the answer to that is no. And, I have a couple of reasons for that. Perez has just been inconsistent. And if you're going to beat Max Verstappen, you have to be as consistently excellent as you can be. And yes, Perez has done well on street circuits, but street circuits like it's only Singapore, Monaco, and a couple, like maybe Miami as well, which are in the calendar. And I think that Max still has the edge on Perez on all the other tracks. And considering the fact that Red Bull is basically Max's team, where Red Bull will support him a lot, I'm not sure that Perez really has the shot to take it to Max this year.
Yeah, I think unless he goes on a run here and really takes a lead in the championship, I don't know if Red Bull will even give him the opportunity to compete if he's down in the second half of the season, which is, I don't think it's the best thing for the sport, but they got to do what they got to do to win the drivers' championship or the constructors' championship. But he has looked good, and hopefully he can at least hang with him in some races and make it the individual races interesting. But do y'all want to pivot to what's going to go down this weekend in Miami?
Yeah, so first off, this is the second year that we've had this Miami Grand Prix at Hard Rock Stadium, the home of the Dolphins. There are a few changes to this track, such as the reduced DRS zone by 75 meters. We will see how much of a difference that makes come Sunday, because we know that this can be a very like high excitement track. I think that there were a lot of overtakes last year, and there, especially in Sector 3, there's just a long straight with the second DRS zone that can cause a lot of overtakes. But there are also a lot of high braking zones as well.
Was that the one that got trimmed down, the back straight?
Yeah, so the DRS zone on turn 11 has been reduced by 75 meters. Yeah, so it's about 75 meters on turn 11, which would be the actually, that looks like not the Sector 3, so it's going to be the first DRS zone in Sector 2.
The second. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that one, I've done this track on the F1 game, and I feel like most people pass at that turn, so that's probably the best turning opportunity. I kind of remember this race last year. Norris crashed. There was some fighting for the lead. Verstappen came out on top. Norris and Gasly ran into each other. But hopefully it's a little bit more exciting than last time. We'll see. It's definitely like there's that kind of section right before the long back straight that's kind of it's just kind of dumb. Like it's super narrow, like chicane under the bridge, and I guess it's kind of hard. I would assume it's kind of hard for them to stay really close to each other right before that long straight, which kind of defeats the purpose of the long straight, maybe. But you want to give your take on that, Kenji?
Yeah, just speaking to like your point about um, the Miami Grand Prix last. Yeah, I agree with you. It wasn't really the most actionable race last year, was it? It was just basically Verstappen, passing signs at the start and then passing Leclerc later on, I think at like lap 6 or something. And then after that, he just kind of drove away with it, didn't he? There was some like thing about Perez potentially passing signs until like his engine gave out, I think. And it was just kind of a bore fest after that, with the exception of Lando and Gasly crashing. So I hope there's some wild cards. The thing is there's some wild cards this year. They're resurfacing the track, which is probably one of the most like significant changes. And of course, Tim, as you mentioned, the DRS zones are being trimmed. The driver's main concern last year was just the surface of the track. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects this year. And of course, as with any Florida weather scenario, chance of rain. So we'll see how that affects it. I remember watching the practice session earlier, and Christian Horner was like talking about the potential for rain on Sunday. So it'll just be something to watch. And with regards to like that weird like section underneath the bridge, I actually think it kind of brings the track some character almost. It kind of gives it that street circuity feel, almost like Singapore. So I think it kind of gives it some character, but I'm not sure if trimming the DRS zone was the right choice considering how boring this race can be. But seeing DRS overtakes is really the best thing either. So we'll just have to see how the weekend plays out, I think.
Yeah, at least to me, that last part just seems kind of like the thing that was at Spain that everyone hated. But I can see how it might be. Like, I think definitely some crashes or contact could happen there. So you got to be careful, and that could make it interesting. We got an American driver back in the States for the first time. That should be interesting. See if Sergeant can perform. The Red Bull livery, I didn't see this.
Yes.
I don't know. It was kind of like meh. Sorry, Tim. Go ahead.
So it looks like it's a fan design livery. I don't know how I feel about it. It's just the Red Bull car with a bright blue or with like a teal and a like a lavender purple color line like across the middle. Like I don't really mind it that much. Like I prefer the old or original and normal Red Bull livery. But I mean, I think it's a cool thing to do to kind of let the fans have a say in what your car looks like for the weekend. I mean, I'm all for that. I don't think it looks as good as the normal livery, but I'm not opposed to it at all.
Yeah, I kind of got like the meh feeling from this livery. Like it's not horrible. I forget which team it was, but I think in Monaco a couple of years ago, or not maybe Monaco, thinking about the wrong thing, but a couple of years ago there was a one-off livery that was truly horrible. And I don't think it's that, but it's also not great as well. It seems unoriginal. One, it's just basically like adding stripes to the Red Bull livery, the original one, which is kind of boring. the one livery that I want Red Bull to bring back is the one they had in Turkey a couple of years ago. The one from like Turkey 2020, I think it was, or maybe 2021. Um, that was a really nice livery, but yeah, I just don't get like the special feeling from this livery. Like McLaren had a really good livery in Monaco a couple of years ago, which was really nice, but this one it just doesn't give me the you know the excitement, or yeah, it doesn't really get me hyped up for this livery, I would say.
Uh, anything else, real quick? We got. You want to just go into predictions now, or we can talk about practice a little bit, I guess. Kenji, do you want to run us through the practice stuff real quick?
Yeah, sure. So with practice one, I don't quite remember the exact order, but I think the two Mercedes were on top, and then it was Leclerc, Verstappen, and Sainz to round out the top five. And then Perez was all the way down in P11, which was a bit of a shock for me, to be honest, considering how Miami is kind of like a street circuit. And Perez, like we mentioned, usually loves street circuits. So yeah, that was a bit of a shock, but I think we'll get onto it a bit later. And then in practice two, it was Verstappen who took P1, and then the two Ferraris, Leclerc and Sainz, I think took the last two slots to round at the top three. So how do you guys think the teams are looking based on
that? Mercedes being on both of them being up there is interesting. They got the fastest lap in Baku, which isn't saying all that much, but still something. But they didn't look all that great in the race, so I guess we'll see if they've brought upgrades. Ferrari has looked better. Aston Martin looked a little bit worse this last weekend. I guess Alonso still did pretty well, but then the rest of the field, we'll see. Midfield is usually pretty interesting in qualifying, so I think it'll just be up to the drivers, kind of.
Yeah, Mercedes were up there in practice one, but I kind of feel like it was a bit of a fluke, really, because they had their laps on really late, so the track was rubbered in at that point. And then in practice two, they dropped down. I think Russell was like 15th or something the last time I checked. Hamilton fared a bit better, if I remember correctly, but he was still not quite on the pace that he had in the first practice session. So I feel like Mercedes, they kind of had a fake out, and I don't think they will be quite on the performance that Ferrari and Red Bull have had. Do you guys think that Ferrari will be able to carry on like their pace from last weekend, where Leclerc was taking pole and everything like that, into this weekend?
I think they'll be able to keep the pace of the second best team, but I don't think they'll be able to catch up to Max and Checo. I guess the story of this season is how dominant Red Bull has been, and I don't see that changing in the future at all. We had Sainz and Leclerc in P2 and P3 in Miami on soft tires, and then we had Verstappen in P1 on medium tires by almost 4/10. So it just looks like Red Bull's going to be the dominant team still, but it looks like Ferrari's going to be second, and I don't see a team like Mercedes catching them, at least not until later on in the season, because we've seen Mercedes make these like late season pushes. But for the next few races, I'd say that Ferrari's going to keep their pace as like this solid second best team.
Ferrari was really good last weekend, but they still are in fourth. So, we can't overlook like what Aston Martin has done and what Mercedes have done so far. But I guess it kind of gets into predictions, but I feel like Ferrari will stay established in that fight for second now, and they've bounced back from that horrible race at Australia pretty well. So we'll see what they do this weekend.
I think for Ferrari, it's a matter of kind of not having your strategy mess up your race, because we saw in Australia, Leclerc kind of crashed out, and then Sainz also just a bad race. So I do still think they're the second fastest car. That does get into predictions for me. I think that. Do y'all want to go into kind of what the podium predictions are for this race yet, or do you have other things y'all want to talk about?
I'm good going into that.
Yeah, sure, we can go into that.
Okay, I'm gonna just go with Max in P1 again. I know that I did that last weekend and I was proven wrong, but that's because Checo just had a great weekend and he's sort of the better of the two in the street circuits. But we saw a little piece of Max's dominance in FP2, which leads me to believe that he will take the first spot. And then I see Perez going P2 again. I don't think that there's any challenge for them unless one of them has a mishap in the race. And then I will go with, this is kind of a shot in the dark, but I'll go with Sainz in P3. I'm kind of waiting for him to have a good race, and I'm hoping that in Miami he can just kind of sneak into that third podium spot ahead of his teammate or the Mercedes or maybe even Alonso. So I'll go with Verstappen, Perez, and Sainz.
Yeah, especially considering how Sainz finished higher than Leclerc in the practice sessions. I think that's a good shout to him. During my predictions, I think Red Bull are pretty much a shoo-in for the win again, barring anything going wrong or anything crazy happening. I'm taking Verstappen again, kind of for the same reasoning that Tim had. We saw Verstappen's pace in Azerbaijan, and without the safety car that De Vries brought out, and without all the strategy mistakes, or I don't know if they're mistakes, but the unfortunate strategy decisions that Red Bull made, I am confident that Verstappen would have taken the win. So I still have him taking the win this weekend in Miami, and Perez finishing in second. I fully expect that Verstappen will rebound from Azerbaijan and take the win here. And for my third slot, Leclerc over Sainz. I think Leclerc has been the stronger of the two drivers at Ferrari, as I mentioned, and Ferrari seemed to be the second best team, which is why I have them finishing up my podium here in Miami.
All right. So I picked Perez last week. That paid off. I just don't know if he's gonna get the job done again this week. Let's see. I don't really want to do the same thing as y'all. I'll go Max, Perez, and then I'll throw Hamilton in there at third. I think he's the next best talent on the grid still, so he's always a good option to stay calm through what could be an interesting race with safety cars and whatnot. You saw what happened with Norris and then Vettel and Schumacher, I think, crashed there too. So yeah, I'll throw Lewis in there, and Mercedes looks pretty good this weekend. So yeah, that'll be my three.
Yeah, I think Hamilton. Sorry.
No, you got it.
Yeah, I think Hamilton's a good shout. Maybe as an underdog, though, I would say, considering their pace in FP2 wasn't quite what they had in FP1. I think if it rains, though, if there's some aspect of rain that happens in the race, I think Hamilton's chances for taking third really increase compared to Leclerc's chances. That's not to say that Leclerc is a bad driver in the wet. He's not, but Hamilton, I would say, is probably one of the best drivers, both in the dry and especially in the wet, among the current grid. So yeah, just the wild card of the rain on Sunday night we can't really predict at this point.
Yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to Yuki Tsunoda. I feel like he's been kind of flying under the radar, because we have his teammate De Vries, who's obviously the worst driver in the grid this year, but then Tsunoda's kind of just been consistently in either the points or right outside the points. In the Bahrain and the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, he got P11, and then in the last two races he's gotten P10. So I know last weekend we did like a sort of like an underdog or like a sneaky points finisher, I think we called it. And I'd say that Tsunoda can do that again, and he can put together a points performance. I like Tsunoda a lot, and I think that he's a very underrated driver. So I expect him to perform well and perform consistently like he has through the season. You know, he hasn't had any like terrible races, although he hasn't had any great races either. I think that being consistently in that one spot, especially for being on a team that's kind of in the bottom of car performance or near the bottom of car performance, to be consistently pushing your team or your car into the P10 or the P11 spot. I think that's a good sign for Tsunoda. And I think Charlie mentioned that he's maybe like driving himself into like almost Red Bull second seat after Perez leaves. I think he mentioned that last week, and I'd agree with that. And I just wanted to sort of give him a shout out because he's been flying under the radar for everyone, but he's just been a consistent finisher in the points and just a solid racer.
Yeah, Snow's been really good. I've been kind of hyping him up all year. So good to see him still performing. For my underdog point finisher, no, I'm gonna go Sergeant. He hasn't looked that bad. I think he's shown that he actually has a lot of talent, but just kind of makes a mistake that costs him in the end most of the time. So home race, definitely a lot of pressure, but I don't think it'll really get to him. I'll say Sargent gets a points finish for Williams and gets his first points in F1.
Yeah, I was gonna go gamble on Sargent as well. Yes, it's his home race, like you mentioned, but I don't think it'll negatively affect him really because Williams is kind of a team that's under the radar, especially here in the States. Maybe not in Europe, but Americans are more likely to support, McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes, teams like that, than they are to support someone deep in the midfield like Williams. So Sargent's a good shout. I feel like Piastri, though, McLaren has been taking some good steps lately. I think that Piastri and especially Norris have good shots at points this weekend. Just looking at the pace they've had early on in this weekend and the positive trend they've been on lately. So yeah, I think McLaren, Piastri, I think that's my shot for the underdog point score this weekend.
All right, I think that about wraps it up for episode 4. Should be, hopefully it's an interesting race this weekend. It's not at dark 30, so we'll get to watch it, and should be a good one. We'll be back next week to cover the recap and then look forward to Imola next. And anything y'all want to say before we close it out?
I'm excited for this weekend. I think it can be a good race, and we can see some surprising finishes by a ton of people. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm also excited because it's Sargent's home race, and he's the first American we've seen in F1 for years. So I like that you threw him in there, Charlie, because I didn't think of him for like that, but I'm hoping he does. I'm hoping he does really well. Not only because he's American, but just I feel like he's a rookie, and hopefully his time is coming where he can prove himself.
Yeah, I just hope it rains, in Miami, because I know I'm a Red Bull fan, and I'm not supposed to say this, but I'm getting kind of sick of Red Bull winning. So I hope that someone else can take the fight to Red Bull this weekend And the only way, realistically speaking, I can see that is if it rains or there's some massive crash between like Verstappen and Perez at the front or something like that. So yeah, I just hope that we can have a more, I guess, intriguing fight at the front than just having the Red Bull sweep everyone.
Yeah. All right. I think that wraps it up for episode 4. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week to talk about what goes on in Miami.